So I've made a few horror games before. I've made a Mr. Beast horror game, I've made this 2D horror game about clones, but one horror game I've never made is the worst horror game possible. You see, I'm a pretty good game developer, but what if I tried to make the worst game possible? What if I took everything that makes a horror game good and did the opposite? I've made the worst game ever before with this game, Bad Platformer, and basically took everything that makes a game good, like graphics, gameplay, and pretty much everything else, and made it terrible. But I wanted to try do this with a horror game. Let's see what happens if I not only try to make a horror game, but try to make the worst horror game ever. To get started, I created a new Unity project. I usually make a lot of 2D games, so when I make 3D games, they usually don't turn out as good, which is what we want, so we're using Unity. The first thing we needed to do for our game was create a player movement system. The process for creating a player movement system is pretty difficult to do. Basically, you have to find an asset and then import it. Now that we had a working player movement system, I needed to create the game environment. This is also pretty difficult to do. Basically, you have to find another asset and import it. Now, I know what you're wondering. If I wanted to make this game truly the worst horror game ever, why didn't I just program the player movement system and create the game environment myself? Well, good point. The game environment we went with was an island, because I thought it would be interesting to create a horror game set on an island. The next thing I needed to do was create an enemy for our game. I started by creating a cube, then programming an enemy AI system. The enemy will move in a set direction, which changes at random intervals. When the enemy is in a set range of the player, it'll chase the player. This enemy AI system is pretty easy to add to games, and now that I think about it, I pretty much use this enemy AI system in most of my games, especially my horror games. So yeah, that sucks. Which is good for this game. I needed to create a texture for the enemy. A lot of horror games have really detailed enemies. For example, this was the enemy from my AI horror game. Since highly detailed enemies are a good thing when it comes to horror games, we just made this. Now our horror game was starting to come along. We had a player movement system, an environment, and an enemy. Honestly, I could probably finish the game here and we would have a horror game, but I needed to add some horror tropes to the game to improve the horror aspect. Horror games have many tropes, such as dark environments, puzzles, jump scares, and more. So the way we were going to make our horror game even worse was by adding in these tropes, but making them as terrible as possible. The first trope we were going to add to our game was the dark environment trope. A lot of horror games usually have dark environments, so to do this, I just set the scene to dark. And there we go, our horror game was complete. Okay, maybe not. We actually need to add some lighting to the game. So after setting the scene to dark, we created a torch and a lighting system. Now, this didn't really look that impressive, which is what we were aiming for, so our lighting system was complete. Okay, before we add any more horror tropes to the game, we needed some actual gameplay, so our player has an objective for the game. Since our game was set on an island, and the island had an enemy, the objective for the player was going to be to find some wood across the island, use the wood to craft a boat, and use the boat to leave the island. This way, the player had something to do whilst avoiding the enemy. But before we add this to the game, I wanted to tell you about our sponsor for this video, Zenva. This video has been sponsored by Zenva's new Godot open world learning pathway. If you've ever wanted to start making games with Godot 4, or you already make games with the engine and want to learn how to make genres like horror and survival games, you'll like this new series of courses, suitable for both beginner and intermediate Godot developers. What's great about Zenva is their approach to making learning game development enjoyable and practical. You'll gain professional video tutorials, written lessons, and interactive quizzes. Importantly, you'll be hands-on with real projects, focusing on creating games in popular genres like horror, survival, open world, and RPGs. Zenva isn't just for Godot. They have courses on Python, Unity, Unreal, and other tools. With one subscription, including a 7-day free trial, you'll unlock over 250 courses and 32 learning pathways, which is extremely helpful if you either want to start learning game development or want to improve your skills. Now, here's the special deal. If you use the link in the description or pinned comment, you can get an extra 20% off the first year of your annual Zenva subscription on top of any existing discounts on the website. This special offer is only valid for the first 50 subscribers. If you're eager to delve into making horror and survival games with Godot 4 or explore other game development areas, Zenva is where it's at. To create the objective for the player, I needed to start by creating the wood object and wood material, then adding an animation to the wood. Now, the plan for the wood system was that when the player collides with the wood object would be deleted as you've collected it. But even though I'm an incredible programmer, I had no idea how to do this in Unity. So instead of figuring it out, I realized I don't need to. This isn't a good horror game. In fact, this is the worst horror game ever, and that's where our next horror trope comes in: puzzles. Many horror games have different puzzles the player needs to complete, which helps add more to the game. Here's a puzzle in a horror game I made, where the player needs to complete this puzzle to unlock a door. Now, the puzzles we were going to add in the worst horror game ever was this wood collecting system. You see, the player can't collect wood at all, which turns this wood collecting system into a puzzle. After putting more objects across the map for the player to try collect, our puzzle trope was complete. Now for our next trope, realistic combat. A common trope in horror games is realistic combat, where the combat system of the game has restrictions in place. For example, back to my other horror game, to take out the clones, the player needs to find a gun. Once the player has the gun, the player is limited to only a few bullets, which means they need to use the gun strategically. For our game, I thought it would be a good idea to add a gun as well, but this is the worst horror game ever. So here's how that turned out. Now, the next trope we were adding to our game was probably one of the most common tropes in horror games: jump scares. Now, to make the worst jump scare ever, all I had to do was create an object that would show a jump scare at random intervals, and that's it. The player doesn't really have to do anything to activate this jump scare, it kind of just keeps showing up. I just think this is a terrible implementation of a jump scare for a horror game, and that's what we want. Now that we have implemented all of our horror tropes, our horror game was complete. Let's play it and test it out. Alright guys, and here we are in the worst horror game ever. Now, to get started, we need to... a jump scare will happen. We need to collect some wood so we can make our boat and leave the island, but we need to... There's another jump scare. We need to figure out how to actually collect this wood because, you know, that's the main objective of the game. So I think what I'm going to try to do is find the enemy because okay, another jump scare. That'll at least make things interesting. Maybe I'll try to find the gun as well. And there's the enemy. So I don't know if we're in range for the enemy to start chasing the player yet. Okay, now we are. Okay, let's go this way. Let's go this way. Okay, we're going to try to find the gun so we can take out the enemy. And there we go, there's the gun there, so let's collect it. So after that, the game crashed. There we go, the worst horror game ever. Thank you guys for watching this video. Once again, if you'd like to check out the sponsor, Zenva, you can use my link in the description or pinned comment. The first 50 of you guys that subscribe will save 20% off the first year of your annual Zenva subscription. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, feel free to leave a comment, and also be sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. Peace.